House will stand at ease until 3 o'clock. House will stand at ease until 3 o'clock.
House will come back to order. House will come back to order. Mr. Clerk, ring the bell. Clerk will read the caption to a group of privileged resolutions.
Recognizing and commending Rudy Koragundi on the Girl Scout Gold Award, Girl Scout Highest Honor. Commending the Rotary Club of Jefferson on its 80th anniversary and for its continued service in the community. Congratulating Lindsay Barth and Dylan Carson on the occasion of their wedding. Recognizing and commending Marissa Williams on the Girl Scout Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Madeline Simmons on the Girl Scout Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Grace Miller on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Ray Matthew on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Marianne Manley on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Anuna Kassam on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Carolyn Davis on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Recognizing and commending Olivia Curran on the Girl Scouts Gold Award, Girl Scouts Highest Honor. Commending the Rotary Club of Jefferson on its 80th anniversary. That completes the reading of the privilege resolutions.
Is there any objection to the adoption of the privilege resolutions? The chair hears none and the resolutions are adopted. Clerk will read the caption to House Resolution 533.
House Resolution 533 by Representative LaHood of the 175th and others, creating a House Study Committee on Innovative Financial Options for Senior Living. This bill has been referred to the Committee on Human Relations and Aging. That committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Representative LaHood to present the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And House members, I bring before you House Resolution 533, which would form a study committee on innovative financial solutions for senior living. This is a priority for the Georgia Council on Aging, as well as the Georgia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. The problem, members, is that we have a huge demographic shift in people in our state over the age of 65. In 2016, there were 1.3 million approximately in Georgia, and by 2040, there'll be 2.9 million. That's a big shift. The need is already great, and it's only getting bigger, a lot bigger. And what we would do in this study committee is study ways to take care of these seniors in a cost-effective manner that supports quality standards. So I would appreciate your favorable consideration. And I'll yield the well if there's no questions.
You have no questions.
Thank you.
Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the adoption of the resolution? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this resolution now be adopted? All those in favor of the adoption of House Resolution 533 will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machine on the adoption of House Resolution 533. The ayes are 171, the nays are 2. This resolution, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. Clerk will read the caption to Senate Bill 195.
Senate Bill 195 by Senator Huffstetler of the 52nd, Burke of the 11th, and Kirkpatrick of the 32nd, to be entitled an act to amend Title 33 of the Official Code of Georgia annotated relating to insurance so as to provide for consumer protections and freedom of information regarding prescription drug benefits. This bill having been referred to the Committee on Insurance, that committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Representative Noel Williams to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representatives, I come before you today with a travel insurance bill. The Travel Insurance Model Act was created in 2017 by the National Conference of Insurance Legislators. This act was strengthened by the working group established by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. What this act does, the Travel Insurance Act creates standardized protections and requirements through building upon existing licensing framework that's already been codified. It creates extensive definitions on damages covered by travel insurance, as well as groups eligible for travel insurance. Maintains a registry of travel retailers that offer this insurance. It authorizes insurance producers to sell travel insurance while also regulating how they sell and market insurance, pay premium taxes, and prohibit deceptive policies. With that, I would ask your favorable consideration on this bill. I yield the will, Mr. Speaker.
Not so fast.
All right,
Do you yield for a question?
I sure do.
Chair recognizes Representative Gamble to your left for a question.
Does the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Does this legislation authorize vending machines to sell travel insurance at the Atlanta airport?
It does.
Thank you.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir, for one more.
Chair recognizes Chairman Martin to your right for a question.
Gentleman, yield for a question.
I do.
Isn't it true that you mentioned that you were trying to stop deceptive practices?
I certainly am.
Isn't it further true that you're presenting a bill about travel insurance that on my desk is listed as prescription drug benefits and insurance for consumers? I'm trying to figure out how that's not a deceptive practice.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question. This was originally a House bill. When it went to the Senate, it became gutted, and it came back to us, and we were able to get this language in and pass it unanimously through the House Insurance Committee yesterday.
So isn't it further true then that what you're saying is the Senate is the ones that are trying to deceive this august body?
I'm not saying that. It sounds like you might be saying that.
No, sir. It is you who are presenting the bill. I thank the gentleman for answering the question.
Thank you. I yield the will.
Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this bill now pass? All those in favor of the passage of Senate Bill 195 will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machines on the passage of Senate Bill 195. The ayes are 160, the nays are 10. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. Clerk will read the caption to Senate Bill 119.
Senate Bill 119 by Senator Albers, the 56th, Huffsteller to the 52nd, Cowser to the 46th, Dugan to the 30th, and others. Being titled an act to amend Article 3, Chapter 5 of Title 2080 of the Fiscal Code of Georgia, annotated relating to fiscal bills generally, so as to require an economic analysis prior to the introduction or amendment of legislation containing tax incentives. This bill then referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. That committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Chairman Houston to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring you today Senate Bill 119, and you probably remember seeing this once before as House Bill 85. And this is our organ procurement organizations. It exempts them from sales tax, and we were lucky that this Senate Bill 119 was no longer used, and we were able to put House Bill 85 on it, and it passed the House. I think it was 168 to 0, and this gives us an opportunity to increase the amount of organ donors in Georgia, and the high end of the fiscal note was just of the part it would cost was just $170,000, the most it would cost, and each year we do 24 Medicaid kidney transplants, and it saves the state $25,000 per kidney transplant, which multiplies out to $600,000 a year. And we hope by taking this, hopefully it'll just be on sales tax 114, which is the low end. We can do more marketing and get more organ donors in this state. I would appreciate your favorable support on this bill. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to ask them. Not ask them, I'll be glad to answer them. I'm good at asking questions.
You have no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this bill now pass? All those in favor of the passage of Senate Bill 119 will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machine on the passage of Senate Bill 119. The ayes are 174, the nays are 1. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. Clerk will read the caption to Senate Bill 214.
Senate Bill 214 by Senator Martin of the 9th, Gooch of the 51st, Wilkinson of the 50th, and Dugan of the 30th, to be entitled an act to amend Chapter 10 and Title 43, the official code of Georgia annotated relating to barbers and cosmetologists, so as to change the number of apprenticeship hours required for cosmetologists, hair designers, nail technicians, master barbers. This bill having been referred to the Committee on Regulated Industries, that committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Chairman Alan Powell to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the House. I bring to you this afternoon Senate Bill 214. And first, let me tell you, the bill started out as a cosmetologist bill. And of course, the senators over there, a lot of times they hadn't been around long enough to understand that if you want to fool around with occupational licenses, the two that'll whoop you the most is going to be cosmetologists, barbers, and funeral directors, because both of those have a captive audience. But the bill that was put in, the genesis of this bill, was about changing change the hours for the apprenticeship program. Now, out of the wisdom of the Regulated Industries Subcommittee and Committee, that was pretty well stripped out. So at the end of the day, then, if you look in section, I believe it's section 2, that deals with the cosmetologist, you'll just see a short blip on there that what we did is we took out antiquated language that the courts ruled 20 plus years ago that you can't even have in there that refers to the term of good moral character, because you just can't define good moral character by law. So we took that out, but at the love and the friendship of Senator Martin, we used this as a vehicle for a couple other bills that came out of the Regulated Industries Committee that I think you've heard from maybe during this session. The first in section 1 deals with microblading. Microblading is that specific art where they tattoo eyebrows on. And this is for folks who don't have eyebrows, for whatever the sundry reason would be. Most of it's because either they're born that way, like a hairless cat, or either they've had chemotherapy, or for whatever the reason. But you know, they tattoo or they put these eyebrows on. And what this bill does in that section of section 1 is it moves that code section from being a tattoo to being a body art, as it should be. And it also moves it from local government jurisdiction for licensing to the Department of Public Health that oversees the way they do this to be sure that this is a sanitary type of a project and they don't get them all infected and such. And that's what it does. And that part was brought to you by the good lady from, the good lady from the 73rd District, Ms. Mathiak. And she did a good job and she spent a lot of time on this, so we're kind of helping her on her way with it. The next section of this bill that we're using would be section 3 and 4, and this bill was passed by the good gentleman from the 141st, and this deals with the electrical contractors. And what this does, it gives a little bit more leeway for the continuing education, so that not only when that board does C&E at schools and tech schools and all such as that, it would allow those folks to do out-of-state C&E. And a lot of y'all been around the block, y'all know what that is. When these associations, when they have their conventions, and they might carry them down to Florida or wherever it is, if they want to have C&E at those, and if they're authorized by the licensing board, they can do so. Also puts a little bit more teeth into the requirements that if you're going to advertise yourself as someone doing electrical work, you better have a license to do it. So that just stops some of that stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what it does. And this takes care of a couple of your fellow colleagues' good legislation that they worked on. Be glad to answer questions. And if there are none, I'll yield the will and ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
You have a couple of questions if you care to yield.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker.
Looks like the Funeral Home Caucus has a particular interest in this bill for some reason. Chair recognizes Representative Collins to your right for a question.
Certainly.
Does my friend in the will yield?
I am your friend and I will yield.
I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the Funeral Home Caucus for realizing the lobby that we have outside of the halls of this Capitol.
Good
Thank
profession.
you for bringing this bill.
Good profession, and when y'all are whispering in the ear to that person, then y'all got their undivided attention.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes the Chairman Parsons to your left for a question.
Thank you, Speaker. Gentlemen, yield.
Most certainly.
I was trying to find the bill there, but this electrical that you were talking about, that doesn't refer, is it not true? That doesn't refer to low voltage? Is that referring to low voltage?
No, sir, and I'm not from Gainesville.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Chairman Martin to your right for a question.
Yes, sir.
Chairman Powell, do you yield?
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to remember, section 4, and I was looking for the bill. I thought it was handed out today and it was in the book. We had something like this earlier this year. Does this language map to what we spoke of in committee? I believe it was in your committee or one of your subcommittees in regulated industries. Is that section 4 language map to what was looked at in committee? I don't have that in front of me now. It's the first time I've seen that.
You know what? I have no idea if that maps anything that was done earlier, but that's the language it says that if you're going to do advertising, that you've got to be a licensee of competency as an electrical contractor to bill yourself out in advertising as such. Now, we did take the plumbing off that you asked so many questions about in the committee about who could put a flapper on a gizmo.
No, sir.
So that language was took out.
True? Isn't it true that it was, I believe, Chairman Fleming that was the flapper expert? Chairman Fleming is nodding head into the negative, but I did not have a flapper problem, sir.
All right.
Okay, I just thought it was similar to that language and just thought the gentleman could clear for me if that was what we had seen before. I didn't have both.
That's
both
right.
sets
There's no
with me.
flappers in here and no yappers neither. Mr. Speaker, if there's no other questions, I would certainly appreciate your vote in favorable.
No other
bill.
questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this bill now pass? All those in favor of the passage of the bill will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machine on the passage of Senate Bill 214. The ayes are 162, the nays are 11. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. Clerk will read the caption to Senate Bill 77.
Senate Bill 77 by Senator Mullis, the 53rd, Gooch, the 51st, Miller, the 49th, Dugan, the 30th, Jones, the 25th, and others. To be entitled, an act to amend Chapter 3 of Title 50 of the Official Code of Georgia, annotated relating the state flag, seal, and other symbols, so as to provide additional protection for government statutes, monuments, plaques, banners, and other commemorative symbols. This bill having referred to the Committee on Governmental Affairs. That committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Chairman Alan Powell to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the House. I'm going to put a little bit more of a serious tone on my delivery of this bill. First, I want to thank our dear friend and the chairman of the Senate Rules Committee for bringing Senate Bill 77 forward. And I want y'all to look at the board up there when you get a chance to look at these monuments. I want you to take a good look at them, because these just aren't one particular monument. But first, before I get into a lot of the stuff, let me just tell you what this bill does. It's a pretty straightforward and a simple bill. It doesn't change a lot of things, except it does make the desecration and the vandalism of monuments. It raises the penalties, triple damages for the cost and the restoration if you vandalize or you destroy a monument. Quite frankly, that's what it does. It does one other thing. It clarifies the existing language of law today, that if local agencies want to move that monument, they can move it, but they have to put it in a predominant place of equal visibility. Something that seems to be fair than in most of that is current law anyway. Now let me talk about that's the real part, that's the guts. It's a simple bill. But I want to talk about a few other things. I want to talk about this bill because this is about inclusion, diversity, tolerance. It's about respect. And when I say that, this isn't about Confederate monuments. It's about all monuments. Take a good look at what you're seeing that's rolling up there. You've got them on your desk. This morning there was a pass-out sheet of monuments that's been destroyed. It's become chic. It's become the thing to do today. It's not civil disobedience, it's a crime. It's vandalism. And when I said respect a while ago, I would ask you to go back to your beginnings, that you're always taught to respect your elders. Respect those that came before you. You might not like it. You might not approve of it. Webster's dictionary describes history as a chronological record of events that affect nations and institutions. That's what it is. Now, no matter what you like or don't like in this day and time, whatever happened in history, but it is what it is. The founding fathers of this nation, you may not hold the same You may not hold the same views that they had, but that was a different day in history. I'm more amazed today that apparently people think that when they watch the movies over years, they think that's how life is. In those days and time, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have rotary dial phones. For some of y'all that are still too young to even know what a rotary dial was. You didn't have automobiles. Gas-powered tractors once upon a time. Everything was manual labor. That's how it was in an agricultural society and an agrarian society of the day. So I understand there are faults. There's faults with every period in history if you look hard enough. But that's what it is. But I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's got to be a stopping place. There's got to be some realism. There's got to be some common sense approaches to history. You may not like it, but those people that came before us that erected the statuary and the monuments, they did it for a purpose to honor. Now, you can say they did it for any particular reason you want to. You know, every time I look at the sweet gum bush outside my mama's old house, I think about that monument, how many times they wore me out when I was a child. And I think about how today, that if the whoopings I'd gotten as a kid for some of the stuff I did, I'd be in a foster care somewhere, and they'd be undercharged for child abuse. But I don't complain about it. I didn't like it then. I look back today, and I think, well, maybe they should have whooped me a little bit harder. And you too, Brother Williams. But we're living in a society today that it seems to be okay in a lot of quarters to vandalize this property. That's wrong. I want you to look at those monuments, the Peace Monument. Why would somebody vandalize the Peace Monument? The Vietnam Welcome Home Memorial, the Revolutionary War Memorial in Decatur, the World War I Memorial, the Vietnam, the Walking Wall Memorial for those soldiers that gave their lives, the World War II Memorial in Albany, Red Oak Historic Cemetery in South Fulton, the Michelle Obama Ancestors Monument in Rex, Georgia, the Vietnam Walk of Heroes, the Peace Monument, the Revolutionary War soldier whose head was decapitated, Screven County, and the list goes on and on and on, ladies and gentlemen. But at some point, we have to say it is a crime. Now, there's some of you out there going to say, oh my gosh, they're trying to do something that ain't been done before. Well, it's already in the law. It's already in the statute that you ain't supposed to do this. You ain't supposed to move these monuments. And we took it away from local governments because of the politics of the day back years ago. But what we've done is we've clarified that language, that if you're going to move it, for whatever the reason, you want to build a building or an addition or a repair or something, or you got a roadway, you can do that. Put that statue back in a prominent location. Have a little bit of respect. A little bit of respect for the folks that came before you. A little bit of respect for the people that died for whatever the reason they did, if it was a monument for that or a military monument or whatever. If you look in the monument, we even went to specifically say civil rights, civil. We covered the gamut of this because we're not just talking about one era or one type of monument. We're talking about every monument. I sat here and I've listened this whole session and past years. I've saw members of both political parties trot to this well to reach out to the good folks in this assembly and to the people of Georgia, and for them to say, we need to pray. We need to pray for the folks that are doing terrible things like the killings in New Zealand. We had a lady up here this morning, presented up on the dais this morning, talking about anti-Semitism. So let me ask you a question. Is there no greater hate crime than to destroy history or to destroy a monument that was put out there to remember what had came before? This only leads and only breeds to more crimes and those hate crimes. So, you know, for those of you who say you're opposed to hate crimes, I quite frankly don't know of a greater hate crime than when I see the Peace Memorial in Piedmont Park that's been desecrated. To me, that's pretty darn hateful. It's pretty hateful when I see monuments in cemeteries, or if I see monuments in churches. I don't care whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. I don't care what your religion is, because I believe that the Constitution says that's your right. But it's also your right as a First Amendment to display your affections for history for that. So let me tell you, stand up and do what's right. I know there's been a lot of partisanship about this issue. I heard the debate in the committee on that, and there was a lot of questions asked that just didn't quite pan out. You know, the most important thing was about local control. Well, quite frankly, this General Assembly does a lot of things to be sure that things are treated equally across the whole state, so not that just because things have changed in one particular jurisdiction that they can throw the baby out. We do these laws for uniformity statewide, county by county, city by city, so that they're all treated the same. I'm a little bit older than some of y'all, not near as old as a lot of you. But I've had a distinct pleasure in my life of seeing a lot of things I don't like, a lot of things I didn't realize until I grew older that I didn't like. I didn't know the difference between a Jew or a Gentile until I was a grown man. And I've probably got one of the best friends and one of the smartest individuals in my life that we're more like brothers than we are anything. But it hurts me to my heart when I hear of Jewish symbols and desecration of their churches or their cemeteries. It hurts me to my heart when I see crosses in a cemetery that have been broke, scattered to the wind. It hurts me to my heart when I see these monuments. I may not even know what these monuments do, but I know that they represented and honored those people who died or they served or whatever before. It hurts me to my heart when I see the monuments to these men and women who gave their lives, that fought in probably the one most unpopular military action that this country ever had, the Vietnam conflict. But what hurts me is I still remember seeing the body bags that was brought back to my home from some of those soldiers who gave their lives in that war. And I asked myself, who in their right mind could desecrate that monument, that statue to the service of those people that gave? And then I take it back, and I go back and I think about the Korean conflict, and I think about World War II, the greatest of all wars of the greatest generation. And I go back to the World War I, and I go back to the war between the states, and I go back to the Revolutionary War. You can find something bad at any time or anybody in history. But I want to tell you, folks, history is what history is. Say what you want to. And if you're not willing to protect somebody else's views and to protect history, then how can you expect in the future that they're going to honor the same for you? I see statues. We honored Dr. King out here. I think to myself, in 50 or 70 years, when they're all dead and gone and nobody may remember it, what's to keep someone from desecrating that? And then I think, hate crimes. Hate crimes. What a terrible thing, ladies and gentlemen. But what I would ask and what I try to do, don't judge me because of my heritage. Don't judge me because of my religion. Don't judge me for the color of my skin. As Dr. King said, the greatest statement he probably ever made is, judge me by the content of my character. Don't judge these folks that came before you because you don't know what they suffered through. Let history be that symbol. If it was something that wasn't good, then you need to say it wasn't good. But don't allow the vandals to continue this type of behavior of the desecration of these statues. Mr. Speaker, I have spoke about all I can speak on this issue. As I'd said from the beginning, this is a straightforward issue. This doesn't do a whole lot, but it does say that if you're convicted, that you have to pay triple damages. It's the punishment phase to replace that statue or to clean that statue and pay the triple damages. And who's got the right to do that? Well, anybody that's got standing, just like any lawsuit. When you look at the folks, like you could probably look at the VFW and the American Legion, somewhere they've got standing to these military monuments, or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, or the UDC, or the old ladies that took up pennies to celebrate the death of their loved ones in the war. But ladies and gentlemen, pass this bill. Don't allow the hypocrisy of partisanship to stand in your way of doing what's right, to honor the men and the women who gave in this country. Mr. Speaker, I would appreciate the members of this House, their favorable consideration, and I ask for your support, and I'll yield the will.
Do you yield for questions?
I will yield for a few questions.
Chair recognizes Representative Derek Jackson to your right for a question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
I certainly do.
Mr. Chairman, on line 25, is it not true that the Confederate States of America is unrecognized country in the United States?
The Confederate States of America was an entity that rebelled 150 years or so ago, and they rebelled against the United States government.
Does the gentleman further yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not further true that those military individuals that you refer to as heroes are not the same military heroes of today?
If I might correct the young man there, I didn't refer to them as heroes. I referred to them as causes that people chose to honor for whatever that reason was. This bill isn't about the Confederacy, it isn't about Confederate statuary, it's about all statuary.
Does the gentleman further yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that the monuments that we're talking about, we're not talking about monuments like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
No, sir. We are talking about those statuary. We're talking about the statue to Dr. King. We're talking about the statue to the gentlemen who were seated after those war between the states, that because of the Jim Crow laws, that unfortunately they were kicked out unceremoniously. There is a statue on the Capitol grounds to honor them. We're talking about the people of Dick Russell, who served this state faithfully as a governor, as a federal judge, as the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, and later as a U.S. Senator, who may not have had the best particular record by today's standard, because it came at a time during the Civil Rights days. But nobody seems to remember what the goodness that he did, that he was a father of school lunches for all children.
Does the gentleman further yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not further true that the two eras that Confederate monuments that are referenced in this bill were erected during Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era?
I have no idea if the gentleman so states. I didn't come here to debate the Civil War. That war has long since been passed. I came here to talk about monument protection of all monuments.
Does the gentleman yield for one further question?
Cough it up, brother.
Is it not further true that I served 22 years in the military compared to your years of service in the military?
The gentleman so states.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Rogers to your right for a question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that since 1776, when this country was formed, that close to 1.5 million Americans with no political affiliations or respect to gender or whatever have made the ultimate sacrifice for this country? And as such, all across this country, in big cities, in small towns everywhere, there are monuments to them and to the causes that they stood for, and that they're all worthy of respect.
The gentleman knows from what he speaks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Jones, Vernon Jones, to your left for a question.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman yield.
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that many of us in this body do not agree with or support many of the statues of certain men and women that are across this country because of our personal belief how they may have stood for something at a time that we didn't stand for? Is that not true?
If a gentleman so states.
Is it not further true that this bill is not about whether you agree or disagree about a particular person whose statue is standing, but this bill is about any statue or monument that is a state agent, that was put there by a state agency or the state government, whether it's the statue with Dr. King that's out here now or the one with the ones that are around this ground, that if you were to damage any of those, that you be held accountable?
Yes, sir. The gentleman knows from what he speaks that we're talking about all statuary on public property.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, I'll answer one or two more, but I think everybody knows their feelings on this. And I'll be glad to answer one or two more questions.
Chair recognizes Chairman Petrie to your left for a question.
Yes,
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, is it not true that 13 million visitors come to Georgia's most historic city every year to enjoy the memorials and the monuments and our parks all throughout our city, which has a huge economic impact on the city of Savannah? Is that not true?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be glad to.
Chair recognizes Representative Holland to your right for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, we're not acquainted, and so for context, I wanted to tell you that in my professional life, I do work to recruit businesses and new talent to the state for economic development. And in working with companies in the past, when similar monument protection statutes have passed in other municipalities and states, I've heard feedback that businesses might then not want to locate to those areas. What is the possible economic development and job creation impact should this bill pass?
You know, I really couldn't tell you about that. I know that there's a lot of people in the rest of the world that sure do think a lot of the Old South, especially Georgia. I know that we have a lot of people that come flocking to Georgia. I noticed that we had a letter that was put out on the desk signed by a bunch of Hollywood types that were going to protest Georgia if something passed or something didn't. But I don't think I've ever heard them say it because of the statuary, much less the desecration of statuary. But what I would say that if folks wanted to come, if they wanted not to come to Georgia because of us protecting statuary, then I'd say don't let the door hit you as you're leaving the state.
Does the gentleman further yield?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to clarify, this means that there was no data examined or comparative analysis to think about what the economic development impact would be.
I have no idea about any data that. I know that in my readings, that there's a poll that I thought, and it just jumped out at me in Harper's Bazaar or one of these magazines. They had all kind of crazy things that they talk about about what people see. And one of the things that was interesting to me that down racial lines, that generally down racial lines, that they all consider heritage with equal respect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd be more than glad to continue this debate privately. I think everybody knows what it is. I'm sure that the political parties have picked their sides on this. I mean, I've read the minority report, but I want to reiterate, this bill hasn't got anything to do with one particular statue or another. It doesn't have anything to do with one monument. This has got to do with all of them. And I will tell you again that if you fail to protect one person's monument, then be prepared not for somebody to protect yours or to stand up for yours. And I will tell you again that this is a genesis. I don't know of anything that's closer to being a genesis of hate crimes than for people to throw paint, to throw a rope around a monument, to tear it down. Because if they're allowed to do that, what's the next step? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for hearing me out on this bill.
The Rules Committee has limited debate to 30 minutes per side, or to an hour total, with the time to be allocated by the chair. And chair is going to allocate that 30 minutes to each side, with the speakers to divide that up among themselves. So we're going to begin with those who are opposed to the bill, and the chair recognizes Representative Kennard to speak to the bill.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in opposition to SB 77. I was raised in Gwinnett County on the Stone Mountain side. I was off of Highway 78 about 2 miles east of the entrance of Stone Mountain Park growing up in the late 60s, 70s, and the first half of the 80s. Virtually every day of my life I've passed by the giant carving of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. During high school, I worked at Stone Mountain Park, and hundreds of times I saw the laser show, which always featured a tribute to the Confederacy, the two generals, the Confederate president. Towards the end of the show, the three horsemen magically animated and came gallantly to life as Elvis crooned, "I wish I was in the land of cotton." My late grandfather was a minister pastoring a small church in the town of Stone Mountain at the end of Main Street. The church property bordered a Confederate cemetery that I roamed frequently during my childhood. And of course, all of my youth and my early adult years, the Georgia state flag was essentially the Confederate flag. What did this demonstrative public presence of Confederate monuments and symbols communicate to me as a kid and as a young man? I'll tell you, because the message was clear. Confederate pride. The Confederate monuments and symbols were sending a message that we should be proud of our Southern past, that the Confederate cause was noble, its leaders were heroes, and they deserved places of honor. It wasn't until much later, well into my adult years, that I was exposed to African American history. What a shock, and what a departure from what I was taught and what had been implied, to learn the true realities and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, the capture of African men, women, children chained, kidnapped, ripped from their way of life, families torn apart, the centuries of brutal oppression. I just couldn't believe it. I started digging deeper. I took classes on African American history, devoured books, frequented museums, attended lectures, consumed documentaries. But I even went further. I began to travel to key spots of the Atlantic slave trade to verify and see for myself. Several years ago, I traveled to West Africa. I went to Ghana's Cape Coast. I've seen the slave castles. It's unimaginable and horrific. I've been up and down the eastern seaboard of the U.S., visiting the ports of arrival of slave ships and slave cargo. I've seen the slave markets that still stand. I have visited the plantations of the Deep South to understand the darkness of this 246-year period. This historical journey has been nothing short of traumatic for me, processing the reality that my country, my state, even my own family participated in the atrocity of slavery. And if I feel this way, I can only imagine how compounded the felt pain is for my African American brothers and sisters of Georgia who have constant visual reminders spotlighted, highlighted on public grounds of the slavery era defended by the Confederacy. It's 2019 and there still remains very differing perspectives on our Southern history, but it's time to heal and move forward. I believe an important step forward is to allow local communities and municipalities to control and decide how to frame the narrative of our past. It's time to move forward. Please vote no to SB 77. Due to time requirements of this floor debate, I now yield the well in consideration of other speakers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Representative Bennett to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the esteemed colleagues of this body. 7 years ago, when I entered into this House, I was granted the opportunity to attend a leadership seminar that involved members from both sides of the aisle. At that time, I was taught common ground, find common ground. And so today, Senate Bill 77 brings up a point about his story. Yes, this is about his story, but it's about whose story? His story. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, but yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place where our fathers sighed. Lift every voice and sing. A poem written by literary pioneer James Weldon Johnson is often called the Black National Anthem. The poem was originally performed in honor of Abraham Lincoln's birthday on February 12th in 1900, and yes, was later set to music. The difference between singing the Black National Anthem and living among Confederate monuments is that people have a choice as to whether they wish to sing the anthem, listen to the anthem, or not. When Confederate monuments are placed in public places amongst communities in which we live, we are not given the choice as to whether or not to engage or see them or not. So for many African Americans, singing the song was their way of showing patriotism and hope for the future in light of the plight of racism that was greatly faced. Deep symbolism was found in the lyrics, allowing African Americans to subtly speak against racial bigotry. It is heavily performed at predominantly African American venues, especially in the Black churches and across the nation. However, the point that is made is that singing the Black National Anthem, being in the presence of the Black National Anthem, is a choice. Being confronted or living amongst Confederate monuments is not. So I do understand that there are many people who hold Confederate monuments in the same regard that some people hold the Black National Anthem. The difference, once again, is that the national anthem recognizes the painful and brutal past of slavery fought in the Civil War, while the Confederate monuments recognizes the unapologetically cruel and divisiveness that the war stood for. Both the Black National Anthem and the Confederate monuments are symbolisms of the past, and they do each carry their story. So one symbolizing hope, the other symbolizing togetherness, equality, and human rights, while one symbolizes divisiveness, oppression, and hate. Where is and can we find the common ground? Today I rise in opposition of Senate Bill 77 because with Georgia on my mind, I dream of a state where the victors of the Civil War represent what is best in Georgia. It is one thing to acknowledge one's history, however, I rise today to emphatically state that it is cruel to be reminded repeatedly and without choice of the pain, ill will, and shame of slavery. Dr. Martin Luther King, yes, did refer to slavery as American shame. The Confederate monuments that exist today at taxpayers' expense continue to inflame and divide our state. Where is our common ground and where can we find it? This bill ensures that the pain and shame of Confederate monuments, yes, it is his story, history, whose story? So I rise today in opposition of Senate Bill 77, asking that we can find a common ground. That common ground is local control, local control, local control, whereby the communities can be represented by his story. Thank you, and I yield the well. No further questions. I will not yield to any questions to give time to my colleagues. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My very able colleagues have spoken to you about the meaning of this legislation from perhaps a personal or moral perspective. I'm here only to speak to one aspect of this, and that's a technical aspect. That's what this bill does legally and how it uses the courts in order to try to achieve its intended purpose. I made a solemn commitment when I joined this House that I'm going to try to get it right. I am not only going to speak to try to make my team win. I'm going to get up here, I'm going to put myself in front of you like this and put my reputation and whatever potential legal expertise you might think I have on the line so that I can try to persuade you about something that I think is 100% correct, and that is this bill will not work. The way it's drafted right now, it creates a private cause of action, which just means a lawsuit. It enables lawsuits if there's damage to Confederate or any other monuments. Again, it's not just about Confederate monuments. But what it does is it allows literally anybody to sue, and it puts no restrictions on who can sue. If I can draw your attention to lines 62 to 65. A public entity owning a monument or any person, group, or legal entity shall have a right to bring a cause of action for any conduct prohibited by this code section for damages as permitted by this code section. That's anybody. That's any person. You could be a tourist in New York, come down here, see a damaged monument, and file a lawsuit. Now, you heard the chairman say something very, very important earlier, which is, well, it's anybody who has standing. Anyone who has standing to bring a lawsuit. So that's the limit. Standing might be the single most important word for you to remember when you think about the technical aspect of this bill. The claim for proponents of the bill will be that standing is established because you're harmed. If you're harmed somehow, then courts will recognize you have a right to bring a lawsuit. Because in this country, the only way to bring a lawsuit is if you're harmed. If you get hit by a car, I don't get to sue for it. That's a fundamental premise of how lawsuits work in this country. The problem is there's no coherent vision for how to describe the difference between harm to one person or group versus another person or group. So really quickly, and I'm going to try not to be boring because this stuff can get dry. Georgia law on standing follows federal law on standing. And under federal law, the Supreme Court has said that standing has to be two things. The harm has to be two things. For you to have the right to bring a lawsuit that makes you unique, the harm has to be concrete and it has to be particularized. That means it has to be real and it has to be applicable only to you. There is no good explanation for why the harm here will be specific to any one person and nobody else. You can't explain how one group would have more of an interest because that type of moral harm the Supreme Court has rejected and said, you remember the Stolen Valor Act? When Congress passed a law that said you can't fake being in the military, you're not allowed to wear badges if you didn't actually earn them. You remember what happened? That law got struck down as unconstitutional. And the reason was because the harm, the idea that valor or honor was stolen, was not recognized as a real harm by the Supreme Court. Now, it might emotionally be significant. We might think of it as people as, well, that's a real harm. But it's not legally cognizable. Why? Because we don't sue people when we get offended in this country. That's not how it works. You can't sue someone just because you find dishonor or offense to come from their actions. So one of two things legally is true. Either nobody can sue under this bill because there's no standing, because there's no cognizable harm, or anybody can sue under this bill. Again, as we looked at lines 62 to 65, it says any person, and when you look at lines 49 all the way down to 54, it explains the defendant shall be liable, but it doesn't say to whom. It doesn't say to the person who owns the monument, to the person repairing the monument. So those 3 times damages, the 3 times the repair costs, go to every single person who files a lawsuit. Now, in other contexts, when we allow the public to sue for something, we usually limit it somehow, like a whistleblower act. That's something where the harm doesn't necessarily happen to you. It happens to the public, but we bring lawsuits to fix it. When we do that, we do one of two things. We either have the Attorney General sign off on it, or we say the first person to file gets to sue. But those are technical limitations that keep the number of people down. I'm telling you today, if you pass this bill, you will create the possibility that people will line up around a courthouse and just drop the exact same complaint. If that sounds ridiculous, then don't vote for it. Because you might say courts will clean it up. That's not our job. Our constitutional responsibility, I brought up a case here. I don't have enough time to read it. Well, basically it says, courts cannot construe statutes to force an outcome that the legislature did not expressly authorize. We got to take the L on this one because we didn't draft it in a way that works. If we drafted it in a way that worked, I would not be up here saying this. My colleagues would come up, they would tell you about other issues we have with this bill. But I'm here for one reason, and that is because we are professionals. It is our responsibility to get this right. This bill does not get it right, and it creates the possibility of endless lawsuits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the will.
Chair recognizes Representative Hobson to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in opposition to SB 77. Mutilate, deface, defile, abuse contemptuously, relocate, remove, conceal. These are words mentioned in SB 77 relating to what cannot be done to monuments in the state of Georgia. As we all know, America has had a dark past. 160 years of slavery, followed by 100 years of systematic discrimination. And we should never forget those things, but we definitely should never celebrate those. Again, taking verbiage from SB 77, monuments that are dedicated to civil rights, political, social, or cultural events, or series of events. All these words sound great when followed by dedicated to honor. When some of those monuments inherently honor those who fought against freedom and the U.S. Constitution to preserve their use of slaves in order to mutilate, deface, defile, abuse contemptuously, relocate, remove, conceal for their own personal gain, there lies the issue. It is important for us to remember that there is a difference between removing the statues that we are speaking on today and destroying them. Now, I am in no way condoning that it's ever okay to mutilate, deface, defile, abuse contemptuously, any of those monuments that we speak of. However, the offensive and insensitive monuments should be relocated, removed, or concealed by finding more appropriate locations for them, such as museums or cemeteries. People who were mutilated, defaced, defiled, abused contemptuously, relocated, removed, or concealed by those whom many of these monuments honor were not ever given that consideration. Now, I do understand that the importance of maintaining history is, it's important, whether it's good or bad, but memorials to the fallen of the Civil War should never have to be wrapped up in the idolatry of the Confederacy or any of the other things that were previously mentioned by Chairman Powell. Now, remembering the Civil War is a historical necessity, but it can be done in an appropriate and even educational manner. There are better ways for us to remember our history than glorifying our state's darkest moments when people were, and genuine people, human beings were mutilated, defaced, defiled, abused contemptuously, relocated, removed, concealed for someone else's personal gain. The relocation of certain monuments and the destruction of those that cannot be preserved is definitely necessary for us to continue to move forward and heal. Any monuments that inherently honor those who fought against freedom and the Constitution to preserve their use of slaves in order to, again, mutilate, deface, defile, abuse contemptuously, relocate, remove, conceal for their own personal gain should be at least considered for relocation or removed if it's the will of the local citizens and the local elected officials where these monuments are actually housed. And also, let us not forget that the main purpose of monuments is to celebrate and glorify persons or people and what they represent. With the adoption of Jim Crow laws and the overall racial segregation during the 1950s and 60s, those statues were meant to remind certain people that they could at any time, again, be mutilated, defaced, defiled, abused contemptuously, relocated, removed, or concealed. Visible inscriptions of oppression on public display on some of our state's most beautiful landscapes should never continue to stand in honor of those who chose to mutilate, deface, defile, abuse contemptuously, relocate, conceal people who were, when they did this for their own advantage. We should honor our patriots who fought for our country and not honor those who fought against it. A century and a half of Reconstruction began. After Reconstruction began, America is still working to this day on projects of constructing a more equal society and also reinvesting in the experiment of a multi-ethnic democracy. There is much about our heritage and our culture in the South that so many people love. It was mentioned earlier about how how great our state is. I mean, we have great food, we have music, we have several stars. You'll hear Chairman Reinders talk about Ray Charles when he gets up here from our hometown. And I mean, those are some of the things that we actually should consider celebrating. And one of the other things that we also need to celebrate is the good-hearted people and the spirit of our hospitality here in the state of Georgia. These are the things that we should honor. These are the people that we should honor. The time for celebrating oppression with the shrines of enslavement it's over. We need to get beyond that. The monuments that we're speaking on today should be erected to elevate and inspire humanity and not honor anything or anyone who mutilated, defaced, defiled, abused contemptuously, relocated, removed, or concealed other human beings. So with this, I ask my noble members of this House to definitely vote no on SB 77. Mr. Speaker, due to the requirements for this debate, I will yield the will without taking any questions, and thank you for your time.
Chair recognizes Representative Erica Thomas to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, colleagues. I rise in opposition of this bill. First, let me start by saying this is not the first time that legislation of this type has been brought before our body, but legislation of this type has not made it out of any committee. I want to say that SB 77 is legislation that should never pass this House. We all can agree that protecting and promoting free speech is the type of good work in which this body should be engaged in. So it is inexcusable that we would pass legislation that strips Georgia's voices from being heard. This bill prevents local authorities from effectively representing their constituents. The state should not be in the business of prohibiting local municipalities from removing property within their jurisdiction. Our cities and counties should not be able to allocate real resources as they see fit. The state should not infringe on the rights of cities and counties any more than the federal government should not infringe on the rights of this state. We can debate historical symbolisms of Confederate statues and whether or not the presence represents. We can debate legal ramifications of this legislation and the impact it will have on the courts. And we can debate on how SB 77 will drain the budgets of our local governments and with frivolous lawsuit payouts. However, we cannot question the severity of local governments and the citizens' right to fair representation. More importantly, we cannot start down the slippery slope of state governments dictating the actions of duly elected officials. I want to also add that we have heard the arguments of which and why these monuments need to be here and why they need to be here and not in museums, because this statute would say you cannot take a monument and put it inside of a museum that's in a public area. And we can talk about respect and respecting history. But I also want to say one last thing before I sit down. I want to talk about my history. And it's been said before, when we saw the oldest Georgian here, 114 years old, stand here, and we glorified her and we sat here. But let's talk about her history and the history of her mother and grandmother. And we also heard as chairman come up here and talk about how monuments some of the monuments reminded him of how bad he was wore out. But let's talk about the history of my ancestors that were wore out by some of the people that we are sitting here glorifying. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield the well.
Speaking on the other side of the issue is Representative Cooper is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. I don't usually rise to speak on bills, but I have a really personal interest in this one because I'm a history buff. And I want to read to you a quote. "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Once again, those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. That's Winston Churchill. We do not get to pick what part of our history we want to remember. There are good parts of our history, and there are terrible parts of our history, but they are all parts of our history. Recently, it takes me an hour to get to work for 19 miles, and I've become a person who listens to books on tape all year round now. And recently I wanted something to go and read, and I popped into the bookstore late at night, and I picked up a book by Bill O'Reilly. Now, I'm not a big fan of Bill O'Reilly for various reasons, but it's about killing the SS. Now, my father was in World War II. He was in the infantry, and he was one of the first units to go into Germany. They crossed over the first bridge. He was shot in the hip. He was left in a foxhole with pain medication, and he was forgotten. And for 3 days, they forgot to pick him up as they went forward in the battle to kill the Nazis. Luckily, a mate went by the temporary hospital looking for him, and they went back to get him. And as a young person, I grew up with a father that could barely walk, who limped all his life and suffered all his life for fighting the Nazis. So I picked up this book this tape on killing the SS, and I had read about World War II, and I had read about the Nuremberg trials, but I hadn't gotten into the real depth of them, and I was appalled of the number of people found guilty and the few people that were put to death for killing in cold blood thousands of men, women, and children because they were gays, because they were Jewish, because they came from Poland, for any reason that they were not considered Aryan, that they weren't blonde and blue-eyed and tall and met a racial description. Many of the people from Nuremberg were put in jail, and they were supposed to serve life sentences. But you know what? In a very few years after the Nuremberg trials, the German government got tired of people going back and talking about World War II. So they changed the laws, and they let those Nazis out that had killed all those people, many of them not in the concentration camp, but moved out of their cities in lines to a pit that had been dug and shot in cold blood and pushed into the pits. And they decided they didn't want to hear about it anymore. And so they changed their laws, and these monsters got out of prison and didn't even have to say and serve their life behind bars. Now, I consider that wrong. And what have we had in Germany and across this country? We have a rise again of people that say it really didn't happen, that the Holocaust did not happen. And we have the neo-Nazis that are going after all sorts of people. If we do not learn from our history, good or bad, we are doomed to repeat it. Now, I have another reason for rising on this bill. It's because we've got an outside art museum right down the street from us. Many of you know that I'm on the board at Oakland Cemetery. It is an outdoor art museum. It's art because of the beauty of the monuments, the carvings, the flowers, the stories that they told from Victorian times. And in Oakland, there is a memorial to the Confederate soldiers and to that war. But you know what? There are Confederates and the Union soldiers buried side by side at Oakland. There's a field there with, the Lion of Lucerne. Those ladies thought they were getting a brand new idea when they got that lion and raised the money for it, but it's a copy of the Lion of Lucerne, Switzerland. And in that area of grass are buried the body parts, the legs, the arms, the identifiable torsos of both Union and Confederate soldiers. I don't want anybody bothering those monuments. When I give tours there, I talk about the conflict and what it was fought over. I also talk about there's a very special grave to me there, besides my husband's, and where I'll be buried. But there's one in the white, what used to be the white section. That doesn't happen at Oakland anymore. Thank goodness, but it was there. And there's a grave to a very special mammy. On one side it says that she, was born to slave, but she goes to God as a special person. And on the other side it talks about it's their special mammy that was there to their family. That family had to go to every white person group of families that were in that area and get permission for that family, for their mammy to be buried with them. Well, you know what? I was raised by somebody just like that. My mother was an original career woman who was never at home. I am the person I am today, the person that voted for the first hate crime and had members of my own group run up this saying, hoped I liked my new friends and what would happen to me in the next election because I voted for it. And I'm that person because of Rosie Lee. Not my mother, because Rosie Lee was with me until I was about 9 or 10 years old when my mother died, and she had moved back to take care of her elderly parents from where we lived. That's history, and I learned it because people talked about it. And they talked about the monuments, and because of what I saw and what had happened. I am the person that cares about people today like I do from both sides of this aisle because people talk to me about what it was. And believe it or not, I can remember riding on the back of the bus with Rosie. It's one of my first memories. And I had cut my leg running on the sidewalk to go kiss her dad goodbye. And I can remember the ladies on the back of the bus with her, the other maids and nannies, saying, "You're going to get in trouble for letting that white kid hurt herself." And Rosie's going, "No, that won't happen to me." This is our history. It's not good, but it's our history. And I don't want us 100 years from now, when none of us are here, and we don't remember the Civil War, and it's not being taught, just like World War II is not being taught, just like most of the kids graduating from school today cannot tell you about our forefathers, can't name them, can't tell you what they did, because we're not teaching history. I don't want that to happen, because I don't want something like the Civil War, named something totally different, to ever happen again. I see the statues and the monuments that are at Oakland and the ones that are other places are moments and reasons to teach what has happened to us and why we should not be that way. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I can't get into the things of the bills. I can only tell you what I feel from what my experiences are. And it worries me if just 75 years, short years, from World War II, we can have people who believe that the Holocaust did not happen, and that neo-Nazis is a good thing to be, and that they should do the things that they are proposing. If it can happen in 75 years, people can forget the war that tore this country apart. And if we're not careful, it can happen again. You can tell I'm pretty passionate this because I care about every individual in this room. I care about the people of this state. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
Lady has yielded the well. Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. We have a minority report, and we will have the chairman's time. By rule, the minority report will have a total of 20 minutes, as will the chairman's report. Chair recognizes for the minority report the minority leader of the House, Leader Trammell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, as I'm sitting here listening to this debate, I've thought about my granddaddy and my daddy. But you know what? What I really think about with this bill are my 3 kids. Because fundamentally what this is a question of whether we're going to sit in this legislative body and we're going to talk about the past all day, or are we going to talk about the future? And when I think about conversations with my grandfather and my father, both now deceased, when we're asking a question like this bill, I know what they would both ask me. They worked their whole lives for the future of their families. And they would ask me, what in the world are we doing talking about a bill that purports to protect and value monuments and things, not people, things. Some of them 100 years ago put by people none of us will ever know and ever meet, and that we place a value on things, not people, things, disproportionately high than we would regular people. Make no mistake, don't let this General Assembly send the message today that we care more about statues than people. And that's what we're on the verge of doing, because we put a formula for it. The formula says that if somebody alters or removes or loses or destroys a monument, that they have to pay 3 times what it costs to replace it. What I teach my children is probably what all of us learned as kids, is that if you break something, you're responsible for paying for it. And it makes sense to enshrine in law that concept, and we have done that. But what makes these things worthy of not just paying for it, but paying for it and then paying for it again, and then paying for it a third time, and then being subject to punitive damages? Well, the answer to that question is a value proposition. And the value proposition is that this General Assembly is sending a message that we as a legislative body value these things more than we care about people. And that's the wrong message to send to Georgia. Now, I could talk about all the problems that the bill would cause in local jurisdictions, because it invariably will. As you look at how we define monuments, it's defined wide open so that it includes anything, almost anything that anybody could want to say was historic. And what that will mean is that in jurisdictions large and small throughout the state, we will open the door to disputes about somebody moving something that somebody had put there that honors a historical figure or a political figure. And I would commend to your attention line 18 and 19 that says that a monument also means a structure name. So if we name a building for somebody, guess what? You better not file a bill to say we can rename that building. You might be subject to triple damages and punitive damages under the law. This bill makes no sense. And it is a deeply problematic bill that we could spend an entire legislative session trying to fix, which isn't our fault. It came from the Senate. But I just want to make this appeal. Let's care about the future. Let's care about people. Let's not put our priorities in things. Because what my grandfathers and my grandmothers and my mother and father taught me was that we should place priority on people, not things. And I know this House agrees with that proposition. This bill sends a very, very different message to Georgia and to the rest of the world and to little girls and boys like my children. Mr. Speaker, I would yield the rest of my time to the minority report to the whip of the Minority Caucus, Representative Bodie.
The Minority Caucus whip is recognized for a portion of the minority report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in complete opposition to SB 77. There are many reasons to oppose SB 77. However, today I would just focus on two reasons. The first reason is SB 77 violates the Home Rule Clause of our Georgia Constitution. Article 4, Section 2 of the Georgia Constitution provides home rule for both counties and municipalities in Georgia. By continually to not allow city and county governments to vote on resolutions or ordinances to keep or remove Confederate memorials is a clear violation of the Home Rule Clause of our Georgia Constitution. SB 77 continues to take away the sworn duty of our local elected officials at the city and county level to adhere to the will of their constituents, our constituents, to choose what monuments should represent the spirit and the moral fiber of those local communities. Now, members of this House, my question to you, is this true democracy? It's continually to take away the sworn duty of our local elected officials to govern on local matters. Are those the values and principles for which Georgia was founded upon? Now, I've heard the House sponsor, SB 77, say that this bill is not just about protecting Confederate monuments. It's about protecting all monuments. Before I address the bill sponsor's statement, I want to talk about something called legislative intent. When there's a legal dispute, our courts have to determine the General Assembly's intentions for a bill by examining the problem faced by this General Assembly when that bill is considered. So I'll ask you, what problem are we looking to address or examine with the passage of SB 77? Well, I really don't know, because there are currently protections for Confederate monuments and memorials in Georgia law. However, what I do know is that SB 77 will give extra legal protections to Confederate monuments that are damaged or destroyed. These extra legal protections are protections in the Georgia law that our houses of worship don't even have. Why are we not protecting our churches, our synagogues, our temples, our mosques, like the extra protections that are being afforded for our Confederate monuments in SB 77? SB 77, with SB 77, I've heard a lot about protecting and preserving Southern heritage and history. Well, I was born right here in Atlanta, Georgia, at Grady Memorial Hospital within blocks of our state capital. My father's father was born in rural Troup County, Georgia. My mother's father was born in rural Clayton, Alabama. So that also makes me a part of Southern heritage and history. However, what some African Americans and other people of color see is the other side of that Southern heritage and history, as told by our grandfathers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, and our great-grandfathers. It's what we read in books, seen in film, the other side of the institution of slavery. Confederate monuments and statues were placed in large numbers in public areas around the South after the period of Reconstruction in the early 1900s. And then again in the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movements as reminders of the Southern cause of the Confederate States of America. A Southern cause which advocated and fought the Union to protect their way of life and the preservation of the institution of slavery during the Civil War. So to my Republican colleagues who support this bill, when you open up your right eye to celebrate the Southern heritage and history of the economic boom of the pre-Civil War South by voting yes for SB 77, when you open up your right eye to remember the Southern cause post-Civil War South by voting yes for SB 77, I also would like you to see a different view by opening your left eye to see the images from the 1860s of a slave husband, father, running away from a plantation in Texas in the middle of the night with no more mode of transportation but his 2 feet to find his wife and child that had been sold to another slave master in Georgia. Again, when you open your left eye to see the images of 1860s of a plantation in South Carolina where a slave wife and mother is raped every night by her slave master. And when she comes home to the slave cabin, to the arms of her husband, after having her mind, body, and soul brutally violated, it is at that very moment when the couple's eyes locked, doing a warm embrace, that they both realize it's nothing neither one can do to stop the attack of her mind, body, and soul the very next night by that same slave master. So, to my Republican colleagues in this House that supports this bill, I'm asking not to change your opinions or belief about the Southern cause, because that's your personal conviction and choice. However, I will ask, before you press your voting machine to vote yes to this bill, to grant extra legal protections to Confederate monuments that are not even afforded to our houses of worship in Georgia. Please open your left eye to see the other side of the Southern cause. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield the will in my remaining time.
Chair recognizes Representative Kausha for the final 6.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, today I rise to speak in opposition to SB 77. This body does not need to infringe on the rights of local communities and decide for them which monuments their public spaces must maintain, glorify, and display. SB 77 is disguised as the bill to protect all historical monuments in Georgia. But it is not lost on anyone that its purpose is to silence the debate surrounding the morality of Confederate monuments in public spaces. There are monuments in Georgia that were erected with a specific purpose to promote a one-sided narrative of history. And throughout this debate, we'll continue to hear the supporters of the bill invoke the lost cause. But if we want to stay true to ourselves, we must look at our history in its absolute entirety. We cannot continue to willfully ignore the context behind these monuments, for they were built with the blood and sacrifice of generations of people. We simply cannot pick and choose our history, and we should allow communities to make their own decisions. I grew up in Germany at a time when Germany as a nation was finally began to grapple with the atrocities of its Nazi past. And I can assure you that was not an easy task to do. Somewhere, every family had a family member who was either a culprit or a victim. But they were still family. And the only way to move forward was to confront our past in its raw and painful reality. This is my history, whether I like it or not. There are many places in Germany where solemn and dark reminders of one of the worst atrocities committed are available to people. But there are no monuments, statues, structures, or plaques that celebrate Nazism or German militarism. Tearing those structures down in Germany did not create an overnight change, but it was a necessary first step to reconcile with our history and acknowledge the joint responsibility that led to that extreme hate. Colleagues, our first step is long due. The only great war the United States lost on its soil is the war we fought with ourselves. And we are still struggling with that past. It's time that we confront this past for what it is, a painful truth. In a dramatic, bloody, and very painful fashion, the Civil War had ended an economic labor force sin and human rights atrocity which the United States had profited greatly from. And that painful experience does not deserve a one-sided hero on a pedestal. There is no glory in killing each other. And there is absolutely no glory in oppression. And we cannot pick and choose our history. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield the well.
We're going on now to the chairman's time. The chair recognizes the chair of the Governmental Affairs Committee, Chairman Reinders. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we go again. Politics again. I've been up here and I have learned a lot, and I've so many valuable people and so many valuable friends. But I've learned three things that are 100% absolutely true. Please, I beg you, take this home with you. Number one, government is too big. But don't take away my piece of the pie. Number two, I want local control, unless I don't like what my locals are doing. And third, I want an honest elected official, as long as I agree with them. You can take those three things and they fit regardless of party, regardless of situation. Because everybody looks at things through the prism of how does it affect me? What about me? I listen to some of the arguments, and the two ones that I hear the most, or the one I hear the most, and why I mentioned number two is the local control. I guess all of us intellectually have our own definition of what local control is. Is local control doing what the city wants to do, or doing what the county wants to do, or doing what the constituent wants to do, or doing what the state wants to do? Because, my friends, you know it. When we sit there and we go down a path of things like, I'm sorry, the young lady, my colleague who asked the question, is there any data of the economic impact? Because you know what? We don't mind Hollywood or corporate threatening Georgia if we evoke our local control as a state. If they want to turn around and said, you know what, you can't hold a tournament, you can't do this, you can't do that unless you do what we say, how come we never say when it comes to, I'm using this as the example, to a RIFA, that California and Hollywood, this is a Georgia issue. Why isn't that local control? Why is it that we have to jump through the hoop of some national organization? The reason is because most of the time they're fitting the narrative of what we want to hear. They're going to have our back. I listen to the offensive and insensitive should be moved. Now, I got friends that are great attorneys and go, that you can't define that in code. We've got places, y'all, in this state that the behavior of a Ray Charles, we got a statue of him in Albany. When he was a junkie, wouldn't be tolerated. You know, they removed Joe Paterno in Penn State. In another place, it may be somebody, you find something else, OJ. I'm just amazed that when we turn around and we talk about local control, you know that we all would be exactly the same if our locals turned around and did something we wouldn't do. Then we try to put a state protection in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. We've seen that movie forever. And the other thing is, I love how we're falling into this narrative that this all has to be about Civil War monuments. I get it. You got friends to the left that help you with that because of the Great Suppression. I get it. We do that to votes and everything else. You have to keep making that point. But the truth of the matter is the party that preaches tolerance, we should be tolerant of everyone. I believe in that. I believe that we should be able to understand each other's ideas and where they come from and their background. And you know what? It's okay to disagree. It's okay to do that. I'm just sitting there going, what this bill does simply, one thing and one thing only, and that is it protects every single monument. I promise you, if we all got together and took a caravan, we'd go, there's some, I don't like that monument, I do like that one, I don't like the way he lived his life, I don't like the way she did. And that can't be a standard. To protect everything is okay. That is true tolerance, not picking and choosing which side you want to be on because it's convenient and because it's politically the right thing to do for you and your constituency at that particular time. There's nothing wrong with saying we're going to protect any monument, whether it's to Martin Luther King or General. It's okay to take that position. Mr. Speaker, I think everybody knows what and how they're going to vote, but I would like to yield the remainder of the chairman's time to Chairman Barry Fleming.
Chair recognizes Chairman Fleming for a portion of the chairman's time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the clerk to put an amendment to the bill on the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I considered very strongly offering the following amendment to this bill, and I'm going to read it to you. On line 7 of the amendment, it would require the following: that a placard shall be placed at the base of Stone Mountain, which reads, "In 1958, Georgia Democrats funded the project to have the following Democrats put on Stone Mountain: Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, in order to commemorate Georgia's role in the Civil War, which was started by Democrats, succeeding from the Union and being the party of slavery and later Jim Crow." Now, I would say to you, one reason to keep monuments in Georgia from being destroyed, which this bill does, is because it reminds us of the past. You have heard it said before, those that forget the past are bound to repeat it. And I would remind you what Georgia was like when Democrats ran the state, and we should keep those reminders around so we don't return to that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well to Chairman Powell.
Do you withdraw the amendment? Amendment is without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Chairman Powell is recognized for the concluding part of the chairman's time.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, you know, there's a lot of things in this society today that people think you got to apologize for everything that's happened. I make no apologies for presenting this bill on behalf of the good senator from Chickamauga. I have no apologies for my views about believing in law and order. I have no apologies to make for saying that we need to add penalty phase as a deterrent for people who desecrate and vandalize monuments. I have no apologies to make for saying that this is about all monuments. I don't even apologize to my friends who've chose to rehash the Civil War here today. And there was nothing civil about that war, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it was bad times. Nobody can understand the horrendous treatment that those people suffered. I don't deny that fact. But yet, the war has long since been gone. But there's only a few that want to continue to make it about that and to conjure up the wounds of racism based on that. This is about all monuments, ladies and gentlemen. This is about all monuments. I listened to the comments, and I'm not going to attribute them to any particular one, but I kept hearing about respect. I'll tell you what the respect was, Mr. Leader. It's about respect for law. It's about respect for law and order. That's property. No matter what you may say, it's property. And I heard people talk about, local control. There's nothing that we do in here about local control. I think the chairman before me had made a comment about local control is only convenient when it's convenient to whoever wants it. But this is about the same thing that we do daily on things dealing with criminal justice. We don't let 159 counties and 700 different municipalities decide about what's the penalties on crime. It's unified, and that's what this is. It's a criminal act. Vandalism, mutilation, desecration of property. And that's what that's all this is about. And it's not just about Confederate monuments. It's about Vietnam. It's about World War I. It's about all of these things. I heard somebody talk about a while ago, well, the churches and the synagogues and the mosque. You desecrate those and you'll pay a heavier price. You try to burn them and you'll see what you pay. But somewhere that poison that starts in the mind of those people that are willing to desecrate a mosque or a temple or a church or a cemetery, that mentality started somewhere. And if it started just because, we're just going to be civilly disobedient, we're going to sling paint on a monument, or we're going to topple a monument that was dedicated to somebody or an event or the war dead. And if they get by with it, then that goes the next step. What's the next step? It breeds hate and poison. I'll say again, I make no apologies for my heritage. I make no apologies for the color of my skin. I would hope that you would dare to judge me by the content of my character, because that's what I do with each and every member of this house and every individual that I deal with on a daily basis. I judge them based on the content of their character, and I would hope that you would do the same. Ladies and gentlemen, I would hope that you would see fit to vote in favor of this bill. Vote against the original hate crimes, the genesis of the hate crimes bill. When people do hateful things, it had to come from somewhere. Those of us who've been involved in criminal justice know for years, we've always said that those people who start doing little things, whether it be to animals or anything else, they're the ones who grow up and they do things to humans. Well, let me tell you, there's a genesis to all criminal act. This is about all monuments, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not up here to rehash the war between the states. I encourage you to vote in favor of this, and let's put some extra teeth in the law about those vandals who would vandalize property.
Previous question has been ordered. Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this bill now pass? All those in favor of the passage of the bill will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. What purpose does Chairman Taylor rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Is it not true that President Eisenhower foresaw this issue, and he immortalized it by saying, "Neither a wise man nor a brave man lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run them over"?
Well, if the lady so states, I'm not familiar with that quote from the president, but He was a wise man. What purpose does Representative Wilkerson rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
It's not true that I was very moved by the eloquent amendment that the gentleman had presented that he withdrew, and I was quite looking forward to actually voting on that amendment. I was quite disappointed that he pulled it off.
If the gentleman so states, what purpose does Representative Holly rise? He waves. What purpose does Representative Derek Jackson rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, is it not true if Robert E. Lee was alive, he would vote no to Senate Bill 77 because he said the monuments of war will keep the sores of war open?
Y'all are testing me with these quotes today, so I'm gonna accept that that's true, okay, Representative? What purpose does Representative Vernon Jones rise?
Yeah, parliamentary inquiry. Mr.
State your inquiry.
Isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that when the gentleman mentioned earlier about the Democrats were the one who initiated the building of Stone Mountain, but a lot of Republicans in this body right now are former Democrats themselves?
I can only speak for me. And the answer is no. What purpose does Representative McLeod rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Is it not true that African Americans pay taxes?
I believe that to be true.
And in doing so, would they not be basically paying taxes on property, on public land, any monument that's on public land that is Confederacy, will be paying taxes to basically degrade their own ancestry?
If it's on public land and the public funds were used to put it there and to maintain it, I think that to be true.
Thank you.
Those in favor of the bill are voting aye. Those opposed are voting no. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machine. On the passage of Senate Bill 77, the ayes are 100, the nays are 71. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. You have on your desk a supplemental local calendar. A supplemental local calendar. Two bills on the local calendar are agrees and disagrees, or having received the requisite number of signatures required, the House delegation wishes to agree to the Senate substitute to the bills. If there is no objection, we will vote on the local calendar as a whole with a recorded vote. For what purpose does Representative Al Williams rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Is it not true, Mr. Speaker, that there has been an agreement on 685 and 686 between the city of Fort Valley and delegation?
If the gentleman so states, I'm sure he knows what he's talking about. All right, if there's no objection, we'll vote on the local calendar as a whole with a recorded vote. Hearing none, it is so ordered. The clerk will read the local calendar.
House Bill 685 by Representative Bentley of the 139th City of Fort Valley. House Bill 686 by Representative Dickey of the 140th City of Fort Valley. Senate Bill 7 by House Substitute by Senator Jones of the 10th, DeKalb County. House Bill 600 by Senate Substitute by Representative Dickey of the 140th, Monroe County. House Bill 610 is amended by the Senate by Representative Collins of the 68th, Carroll County.
Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered on the local calendar? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bills? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall these bills now pass? All those in favor of the passage of the bills on the local calendar will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machines. On the supplemental local calendar, the ayes are 157, the nays are 13. These bills, having received the requisite constitutional majority, are therefore passed. Clerk will read the caption to Senate Bill 131.
Senate Bill 131 by Senator Jones, the 25th, Beach, the 21st, Mullis, the 53rd, Harper, the 7th, Brass, the 28th, and others to be entitled an act to amend Title VI of the Official Code of Georgia annotated relating to aviation so as to create the Georgia Major Airport Authority. This bill having referred to the Committee on Rules. That committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Chairman Tanner to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take just a moment, if I could, to thank our Speaker and the entire leadership team on both sides of the aisle for working with us over the past several days and quite frankly for some of this legislation over the past 2 years. I also want to specifically thank the governor and his leadership and his team for helping us as we work through putting together this substitute that's here in front of you to Senate Bill 131 over the past few days. The bill does several things, and I want to attempt to walk you through that in a concise way, but without belaboring the point. This is a very measured approach, and I've said that quite frequently around the airport question to several of you as we've talked. Section 1 of the bill specifically deals with the creation of a major airport legislative oversight committee. We know that the Senate bill that came over from the Senate, Senate Bill 131, in its form it came over from the Senate, created a takeover, so to speak, mechanism for the Atlanta airport. It would have created an authority that would ultimately work through the FAA to transfer ownership of the Atlanta airport to the state, to a state-created authority. I've heard from many of our members, specifically Republican members, that they would like to see that happen. People who know me, and I'll say this specifically to my friends in the minority party, I think know me to be a policy person. I typically am not a partisan legislator. I try to focus on policy. So in looking at this through the eyes of a policy legislator, I did not feel that was good policy. And so as a result of that and the result of the leadership of this House, what you have in front of you today, I think, goes to help address the core concern that we've heard a lot about, but does not go too far. The core concern we heard in committee was around the issue specifically of the concessions and the procurement process at the airport. And the concerns are not new. Many of these have been going on for several decades. The committee that you have, this major airport legislative oversight committee you have in front of you, would have several members. They would all be from the General Assembly, be the chair of both the House and the Senate Transportation Committees. Both of those committees typically have legislative oversight over things relating to transportation, including airports. The chairs of both appropriations committees, and then 4 additional members appointed by the Speaker of this House, 2 of those members coming from a county or an adjacent county to where a commercial airport affected by this bill lies, 4 members appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, again, 2 that represents a county in which a commercial airport is located or a county which adjoins that county. The chair of this oversight committee would be appointed from these members by the Speaker of the House. The vice chair of this committee would be appointed by the Lieutenant Governor. Now, this oversight committee is very similar in its setup and its nature and its authority to what we all know and we've worked with MARTOC. This authority would be able to evaluate public safety, prudent, legal, accountable expenditure of public funds, equitable and transparent procurement practices for the provision of services at the airport, and efficient operation. This committee would also have the ability, through doing certain things, to have subpoena power, to be able to require witnesses to come testify, and to compel certain documents be presented. Audit documents, financial documents, bid proposals, etc. Would be required if they requested it. The state auditor of our state, GDOT, the Attorney General, the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Economic Development, all are specifically required in this legislation to assist this oversight committee in carrying out their duties. In addition, the committee may also establish citizen advisory committees to act in an advisory role only. Now, I know I've heard some concerns about that, the citizen advisory role from some members, and I will tell you, this major airport legislative oversight committee does not just include oversight power at Hartsfield, Jackson, but it also would be the 10 commercially recognized airports around the state. So there may be a need in some of these other areas to have a citizen oversight committee to give them information and advice. The oversight committee here is a step in the right direction. Again, I'll say again, it's a very measured response, and it's good policy, and it's not just a political answer, and I think that's important. Part 2, Section 2-1 of the bill is the exact language that passed this House before crossover in House Bill 447. This was a jet fuel exemption legislation. Again, it's unchanged from the version that passed the House. It extends the exemption date from June 30th, 2019 to June 30th, 2039. It imposes a 0.005 cent tax on distributors. And I know that we've had a lot of conversations, and I've had a lot of conversations today with members of this body that have concerns about the rate 0.005 and the need for funding for our airports. So I want to say to you that I am committed, as this thing moves forward, to continuing to have that dialogue with the governor, his staff, and with the Senate, so that when we bring you back a conference committee report, we're able to come back with something that we all can be comfortable with as we move that forward. So this, again, is not the end of the conversation. The next part of the bill is what passed out of this body as House Bill 511. That was the major mobility and transit bill that we moved through this General Assembly before crossover day with a great bipartisan vote. This was a result, again, of the House Governance and Fundings Commission, 2 years of work, a great deal of work, many hours, many meetings, great representation from both the majority and minority caucus and other citizens who served and worked very hard to bring some proposals to you that you could be very proud of. And it really hit home to our rural communities across Georgia. Legislation that could be transformational. Just to remind you, this legislation in 511 did away with Greta and created the Department of Mobility and Innovation. It streamlines bureaucracy around the delivery of transit services all around Georgia, specifically rural Georgia. Again, it's the same legislations we passed out of the House already earlier this session. I will tell you, this part of the bill has the potential to really transform how we can remove barriers for those less fortunate in our state. If for no other reason, if you're struggling with other parts, I would ask that you consider continuing the conversation across the hall to get to this part of the legislation. Section 3-2 is language dealing around the 10-year plan with GDOT. When we passed House Bill 170 in this House, we put, during conference committee, there were some conversations around all the increased funding that we were producing for roads and bridges, that we wanted to make sure there was some legislative oversight in that process. So we required that each year that GDOT bring a 10-year plan of how their dollars were going to be spent back to the House and Senate Transportation Committees. They would review that, and then they would submit a letter to the Appropriations Chair in each chamber that had been done and approved. What's happened is the strict interpretation of that language is that they are required to give us a percentage in buckets of where dollars are going to be spent, not necessarily individual projects. What this does is make it clear where we're spending those fee dollars, hotel, motel dollars, heavy equipment fee dollars that are additional revenue that's not motor vehicle fuel money, that we want specific projects of where those dollars are going to go to make sure we have the appropriate oversight we need as a legislative body. Those are, again, it's a lengthy bill, but two of the pieces you've already had the opportunity to debate and vote on. That's House Bill 511, and that's also House Bill 447 that's passed out with great majorities of this House. I would ask each member to give us the opportunity to continue this conversation, because today is not the end of Senate Bill 131. And we ask that we make a strong bipartisan showing to the Senate that we want to have good conversation about real policy that affects Georgians, and not just a political conversation. And I would ask that you join me in voting for Senate Bill 131, and that you allow me and others the opportunity to continue this conversation and bring back something that this chamber can be very proud to take back home, that can change lives in a very positive way for our citizens. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Chair recognizes Representative Gullett to your right for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the chairman yield?
I do, yes, sir.
Is it not true that this bill would rein in the actions of airports who decide to be bad actors and intend to stifle economic development elsewhere in the state?
It would, not knowing specific circumstances, I can tell you that this Legislative Oversight Committee would be empowered to look at allegations, to look at concerns that might be raised of wrongdoing, and then they would have the ability to investigate that through their power, and if they found that, they could take the appropriate action or request that action be taken by the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Momtahan to your right for a question.
Chairman Tanner, do you yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that there is some hypocrisy in the fact that the city of Atlanta does not want anyone meddling in their airport, yet they currently have a lawsuit filed against my county?
I'm not familiar with your specific circumstances other than conversations I've talked with you about, but if the gentleman, I believe the gentleman believes that to be so.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that this committee would be able to inquire as to the status of actions of airports that fall under this provision?
They would.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that in voting for this bill, I'm voting to increase transparency of our state's largest economic investment vehicle?
Yes, sir. A vote positive for this bill is definitely a vote for increased transparency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Al Williams to your left for a question.
Will gentleman yield?
Yes, sir, for my friend on the Transportation Committee.
Sir, is it not true that I've served on the Transportation Committee for the last 8 years?
Yes, sir.
Is it not further true that I have great respect for your expertise?
I hope that to be true.
Is it not further true that I initially told you that 511 was like a Rembrandt? It was so well crafted and so beautiful. And is it not true that you then took a Polaroid picture and tacked it to the bottom of a pink flamingo and called it an airport takeover bill and changed the value of the Rembrandt?
You didn't say those exact words, Mr. Representative. I don't think you want me to repeat the exact words, but you said something similar to that.
Further question, if the gentleman further yield.
Yes, sir.
Is the gentleman indicating through conference committee that you have a tool that might possibly be able to loosen up the Polaroid that has so damaged this former Rembrandt?
I told you that we would send it to a plastic surgeon, give the plastic surgeon an opportunity to see what came back, and then I asked you to consider a yes vote, and once the work was done, to make your final determination, but to allow me the opportunity to continue the conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir, I will.
Chair recognizes Representative Beasley Teague to your left for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it not true that I, that have lived here for 50 years, didn't agree to how this body set up mortar board, and to tell me that we're going to do another board to watch my house, my tax money? If I look at the examples in the state of Georgia, is it not true that I haven't seen one person that represented the areas in which the boards were in any of these pieces? The ports, for one. And so I don't see the airport being any different. Do you see any difference in that in the authorities? In any type of watchdog situation that would bring on the people that are paying the taxes and are suffering and moving, doing all the things that they have done for this airport that we're talking about now? Thank you.
Well, and I know the lady to believe all that to be so. I will say this: the port. You mentioned a couple other examples, Port Authority being one, World Congress Center being one, and quite honestly, the argument from across the way from the Senate is like those. The airport is one of the biggest economic engines in the state, and it's bigger than just the city of Atlanta. Its importance is bigger than the city of Atlanta. Its money that is used is not tax dollars from people who live in Atlanta. The money is actually the money generated by the airport. All of us in this room fly and use the airport. It's an enterprise fund. It's a separate accounting of funds from the city of Atlanta, so it's not tax dollars, but it's the fees that generate the dollars. So I believe, and this is my personal belief, that the airport, for the most part, is very well run. I also believe that a full takeover of the airport is not good policy. I do believe, though, that to ensure long-term viability of one of the most important assets in the state of Georgia, that, again, I use this term, but a very measured approach is what we're proposing here, which, again, and I want to make sure we're clear that every member understands this. This does not dictate how the city of Atlanta runs the airport. It does not require them to do one single thing different than they do today. They do not have to come to this legislative oversight body and ask permission. They don't have to ask permission who to hire, who to fire, who to give bids to, how to set up their RFP process, nothing. This oversight committee does not have that power. However, if laws are violated, or if there's a concern they're being violated, or unethical type behavior, this would be a body that would be made up of members that are elected from the state to be able to look, to see, and a lot of members have come to me and said, many of the things that we've heard and we've read are unsubstantiated. And I believe that to be so. This would be a legislative oversight body that could either substantiate or unsubstantiate those claims very quickly. So because of that, that's why I support this measured approach.
Do you further yield?
I will, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Representative Hughley to your left for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
If you'll be nice to me.
I'll be nice.
Thank you. I'm just kidding.
Can you share with us your thinking when it went from the Atlanta airport to this other 10? Your thinking in terms of bringing all these airports into this particular legislation?
I think the idea is that you don't just want to single out one entity. That if it's a commercial operation, a commercial airport, that you're going to have the same ability to have that oversight, so that if you have an allegation or a concern of this behavior occurring at other airports, you have the same power. And I will tell you, I've heard from members, both minority members and majority caucus members, who represent areas with one of these airports, who have been positive about that oversight and had no issue with that. I also have not heard from any of those other airports that have raised an objection. But I will tell you, I'm committed to continuing that conversation if we have the opportunity after this vote, and if we're able to get something to a conference committee to look at that structure. And if there's concerns around that and the number of airports that should or shouldn't be in it, I'm committed to continuing that conversation. I'm not here claiming to have all the answers, but I think this is a place to start a conversation, and not end a conversation.
Thank you. Would the gentleman further yield?
Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it true that I believe that if it's not broke, you shouldn't fix it? And also, with the authority that this bill gives to this oversight committee, people with the wrong objectives can harass, in my opinion, these local airports. And that's my concern.
I believe that the lady believes that to be so. I would differ in that opinion, and that I think that the members who serve here, the members who serve specifically in the roles that would be appointed to this committee, are not in the business of harassing, but it would be an ability to hold accountable and transparent in this process. Quite honestly, I believe this legislation could be very positive for the city of Atlanta, for the airport, can offer a great deal of transparency, and could be an opportunity to stand up and say, we have nothing to hide, nothing. We want to continue to run an airport that we have ran for 90 or so years and ran it very well, and we're fine with open and transparent government. So pass an oversight committee, just don't take us over, and let us continue to be the world's best airport. So I think it's a great opportunity to embrace transparency. And I would encourage every member, when they vote, to think about open and transparent government, how important that is. You know, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to yield the well, Mr. Speaker. I teach the adult Sunday school class a lot of times at my church, and I tell them a lot of times, I said, you know, you can be in a dark room, but just give a little light to the situation. It'll light that entire room up. I think the problem sometimes is the lack of transparency around this process. Doing what we're doing is not a takeover. It changes no management at the airport and how it's operated, but it does increase transparency. It opens up and sheds just a little bit of light into the room. It makes people feel comfortable, and it moves us forward in a good, measured policy way and not a political one. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask favorable consideration for SB 131. Let's send this back across the hall. Let's continue this conversation, and I'm committed to working with every single member in this body to perfect this legislation so we can transform the state of Georgia. Thank you.
Gentleman has yielded the well. We have other members that wish to be heard. Chair recognizes Representative Gardner to speak to the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's no surprise to see the chair of the City of Atlanta delegation stand up to oppose this particular portion of Senate Bill 131. I really wanted to talk a little bit about perception versus reality. In the Rules Committee last night, the facts that were so-called facts that were presented were lots of them were 20 years old. They did not reflect the changes that have been going on in the city of Atlanta, particularly under our last mayor. It takes a long time to change a culture. But you know, the 57th district actually has 62,000 registered voters, and more than 50% of those people vote. It has at least 2 city council people who've been working very diligently to make the airport more accountable to all of us. We understand, and I bet everybody in this room agrees, that this is an important economic engine for all of our state. But it has been Atlanta who has taken the risk. Unlike the Port Authority was created by the state. The state did not create the City of Atlanta Airport. Atlanta Hartsfield Jackson was created by the City of Atlanta. So as the city works hard to improve the processes, in fact, they're much more transparent than they used to be. I've lived here for 46 years, and trust me, I've seen some things over the years that made me shudder. But things have changed dramatically. Some of the things that they talked about in rules are now simply online. That old procedure that used to be the procedure is no longer true. Now, I'm not saying the Atlanta is perfect. It's far from perfect. But what kind of oversight is there? We know the Federal Aviation Authority audits every single airport in this country of this size every 7 years. And this year they're coming to audit the Atlanta airport, and they will do it again 7 years from now. If in their annual audits they find there is an issue, they bring them to the city, they bring them to the airport, and they're remedied or they're somehow sanctioned. It's not just the FAA that has oversight of this airport. It's our very own B.J. Pack, who is the U.S. attorney. He has very successful brought some suits against people who were not appropriately behaving as servants of the city, and those people are being convicted. So what our allegations are one thing. What we don't hear after the AJC articles is how many of those allegations have proven to be true. Well, in fact, in the FAA example, all of the things that have been brought to the attention have been remedied. I've discussed this with the chairman, and I would urge you to think about the implication of the instability that could be created and has already reverberating around the bond market. Oh my gosh, if the AA rating of the City of Atlanta Airport is in jeopardy, that may not be a bond that I want to buy. So the AA rating of the airport may be challenged. If the issue is really about procurement, why don't we just list the procurement as the one reason to have oversight instead of adding all the other things that are listed in the bill? I urge you to consider the implications of creating an unstable environment for the City of Atlanta Airport as well as the impact that it could have on what is clearly a strong economic engine of all of our state. So thank you very much. I urge you to vote no. I certainly have supported the chairman's other two bills. A rural transit idea that is largely funded by the metro region. It seems a reasonable thing for us to do. And the jet fuel tax is something that we should do. But I don't think it's important, and I don't think it's appropriate to continue to insult the city of Atlanta that is working hard to make this process more transparent. Please join me in voting no.
Chair recognizes Representative Abel Mabel Thomas to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise as a native Atlantan, and I rise as Vice Chair of the City of Atlanta delegation. Distinguished members of this body, just to set precedents and some bearings, I was in the Rules Committee on yesterday when this bill was brought forth and debated, and heard a lot of pros and cons on both sides. This bill is a combination of, I think, House Bill 511 with the jet fuel and the House Bill 447 that talks about the Georgia Major Airport Authority, and it talks about the authority taking place in 2021. But I rise today specifically from the perspective of Senate Bill 131, which has drug the Atlanta airport managers, mayor, members of the city council, and really Atlanta citizens through the newspaper, TV, and a lot of the things that have been said, as been stated before, have not been substantiated. So I rise in opposition to Senate Bill 131 as it is written, but more strongly as it was proposed. I call this new substitute Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport Takeover Light. Built in the modern era, Mayor Maynard Jackson renewed and expanded and brought this airport into the 21st century. This airport was built on time and under budget. It is one of the busiest airports in the world and in the United States for sure. Something was put on our desk said, according to the Wall Street Journal, inaugural ratings of top U.S. airports ranked Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport in the top 4. And I ask you, who is for corruption? Corruption is bad. Transparency should be the rule of the day. But why move so publicly and negatively to take over the Atlanta airport? One would think that there are not scandals in the state of Georgia. And I don't know who would come over to oversight us as it relates to scandals and misappropriations of money. Now, this may not be the exact same thing, but I know in the last 2 months or 3 months at least, there was a big article on TV about Georgia Tech. Don't be mad at me. It was about Georgia Tech, and it talked about misappropriations, and it had to get to a point where a whistleblower brought it to the attention. And what was required was that the president of the school come up with a plan as to not make this mistake again. Nobody asked for his resignation. Board of Regents, which has some level of oversight, did not drop the hammer. And then I began to look further and found out that that same said quality school had had issues before the 2018 situation, going back 2013, and other examples when you hit Google, when you pull up recent scandals in the state of Georgia. So I don't understand why there's such a rush to judgment and accusations about an airport that Atlanta built 100 years ago. And since we're talking about history, the city of Atlanta has run the airport for 100 years and has invested billions of dollars and created a world-class asset. The airport bond rating is AA+, the highest bond rating available to commercial airports. It is stated, according to the Georgia Municipal Association, but specifically to Diana Pope, Director of the Finance and Investment Division of the Georgia State Finance and Investment Commission, it is quite possible that adding a layer of state oversight or changing ownership of the airport would cast a negative perception that could negatively impact credit ratings because of the potential disruption in services and uncertainty of how it may impact existing and future business relationships. Every authority does not work. Some way, because we are the state, usually the structure that was put in place only allows those persons in the highest levels of leadership to pick the members. But even with the Transportation Authority, the persons who had to run for the seats, they had to live particularly in a particular district, and somehow the way it worked out for Fulton County, which is the largest county in Georgia, the county commissioner, Rod Pitts of Fulton County, was not elected to the Transportation Authority. So sometimes even our best work does not always end up making sure it is inclusive as it needs to be. I looked on page 3, and y'all can look on page 3. There's created the Major Airport Legislative Oversight Committee to be composed of the following members. It's everywhere from the Transportation Committee, House and Senate, the Appropriation Committee, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Lieutenant Governor. But also, if you look at it closely, it also says that the Speaker of the House, who's my friend, has the opportunity to choose who's going to be chair of this particular authority. And I think that the Lieutenant Governor, he gets to choose who's the vice chair of the committee. So even though we trust leadership, we don't know how inclusive an authority will be, because many of our authorities that are set up somehow it is not as much as what we would like minority participation in them. Not to mention, going another way, is that when you talk about procurement and you look at use DOT, for example, or some of the other state agencies, it's under 5% of minority businesses that do business with the state of Georgia. But then think about it. To drag in Augusta, Savannah, Athens, Macon, Columbus, and other airports that have 300 commercial passengers in it is also challenging. Some of you here have not been able to even to tell your people in your home area that they're going to be affected by this bill, because when they think of Senate Bill 131, they think of the airport of Atlanta takeover. Now, in this body, we've talked a lot about Confederate monuments, and we've talked about hate crimes, and we sort of have opened up a conversation in the Georgia General Assembly that's probably not as strong or stronger than I mostly have heard. So to follow along that track, I would like to say to you, some of you may not know, but during slavery, if there was something stolen and they could not get a confession, and not that the slaves stole it, yet they were the only ones accused, they would be punished and sometimes even put to death. So it kind of feels to me, it's my opinion, to get to Atlanta, you would subjugate all the airports in Georgia that have 300 commercial passengers to an oversight authority. I think this is a heavy, bureaucratic, and heavy-handed way to get to punish Atlanta. I submit to you that the whole bill is not bad. And you know they say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I submit to you today that we should vote no on this bill and start again and take a different approach. And that approach would be one that does not single out one airport, drag it through the mud, and then in order to say, well, we're really not messing with Atlanta, put all these other airports, and many of you members have not been able to even hear from your people about this bill. I yield the well and ask you to vote no on Senate Bill 131, not by all the words, but what the intent of the initial bill was in this state. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Chairman Knight to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Transportation seems to be a hot topic in Georgia, and it should be. It's probably one of the most important assets that Georgia has. You look around in our total transportation infrastructure, and we've led. Quite frankly, we've led in Georgia. Our number one status of number one state to do business in the country is primarily, or could be attributed, or can be attributed to the fact of how we invest and how we take care of our transportation infrastructure. Very important. I'm going to get up and speak to two parts of the bill today. One, a brief comment. I know Chairman Tanner has spoken to, I think, the rural transportation part of it. We'll make a brief comment on the oversight. I want to congratulate Senator Burt Jones for the courage to come up and to investigate this. When there's tarnishment on one of Georgia's brightest and best assets, I think we ought to address it. And I would think that the folks that are in the spotlight would want it addressed. This airport is very important to Georgia's economy, not just to Atlanta. I grew up in Griffin, still represent Griffin, and I can tell you that a lot of my folks depend on Hartsfield Atlanta Airport for jobs and for a living. It's important for our state and for commerce. So again, I want to congratulate. I think this is the right step, and it's a measured step, and it's going to provide oversight. And I think people would welcome that, to either clear their name or to make sure that if there is something going on, we can clear it up. Specifically, though,